Okay, Paul, good to go.
Do we have the sketches from Carol Kozowski on the screen for you?
No, I'm seeing a Zoom screen. I see it's you that's sharing, but all I have is, okay,
That better?
a bunch of people.
Yeah, there's a few of the sketches from Carol to let our presenter see what she thinks of you. Unfortunately, I got left out there, but it is a delightful thing to receive the sketches, and there are some of you for whom it's quite clear, and others that I'm struggling with a little bit more. But Carol has commonly been kicking out a sketch every week of the presenter, and so I wanted to begin with that this evening. And then let me highlight that this evening is our regular review. We commonly look back at the previous 8 sessions. Tonight, we'll begin with Derek Sainsbury, Storming the Nation, then Bill Shepard, the First Mormon Apostles, James Lucas, Zion and Fourth Nephi, Mike Riggs, Hawn's Mill, Hamlet, Casey Griffiths, The Relics of Mormonism, John Mueller on High Priests, Val Larsen on Parallels between Mosiah and Zeniff. And if that's all agreeable, then let's get the invocation and get underway. Pray with me, please. God, the Father of the human family, dysfunctional as we are, so often producing calamity. In Israel, Palestine, where now we see renewed war. In Ukraine and Russia, human rights violations we abhor. Yet you, our Creator, encourage us to live in peace, to become functional, loving people whose respect does increase. This evening, we see our family at war, killing each other over claims to segments of the earth, failing to recognize that you create each of us to be talented, productive persons, each of worth. In the Book of Mormon, we see examples of our family's warring past, and a few examples of the promised land, where people have reached a peace on earth in our land so vast. And as we review where we are and where we would like to be, we see your guidance, your grace, your forgiveness for the human family. And we ask for your Spirit to somehow intervene, to help us through our crises, to create a peaceful scene so that our children can inculcate the child, the lamb, and the lion, learning the culture, the language, the attitudes of peace in the land of Zion. Amen. All right, if I can get the stop share now, let's get it moving, and we begin. Thank you, Derek, for coming back to share 5 minutes with us. And if you do that, then we go to question and answers afterwards.
Okay, is that showing up?
It shows up.
All right. Thank you, Paul, for that prayer. I'm always so impressed with the way you pray for us.
Well, we're in a tough situation right now.
We certainly are. We certainly are. Well, my presentation it was on Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, specifically the missionaries that were sent out in large numbers to both preach the Restoration, the Book of Mormon, and also to advocate Joseph Smith for president of the United States. And so in my presentation, I asked some questions, and the answers to those questions were, yes, Joseph did run a very serious campaign, but no, Joseph was not a very serious contender for president of the United States. On the surface level, his candidacy was an attempt to protect the Latter-day Saints and other religious minorities from very real and very present persecution. But with the release of the Council of 50 Minutes and all of the journals that I was able to read, and letters between Joseph and other leaders, and as well as what the missionaries understood that they were doing, there's more to it. And I talked about how two roots kind of came together to create that campaign. One being the cause of Zion, trying to create a Zion community that by its very nature had countercultural elements that didn't sit well with its neighbors. And that cause of Zion, despite those issues with their neighbors, led to an increasing idea of heavenly or divine guidance for government on earth. Whereas the opposition to Latter-day Saints building Zion led to revelations that pointed Joseph in the direction of what I've called divine constitutionalism, or in other words, that the Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights, exists to protect the rights of all people. And as Joseph tried to play these two ideas out, it eventually led to his presidential nomination and the creation of the Council of 50, which then led to his campaign. This is a map that shows where the over 635 missionaries were sent, as well as the three major newspapers that were either created or switched their main coverage to Joseph Smith's candidacy. My research found that the old number of just over 330 missionaries was wrong. It took me about a decade, but I was able to track down over 300 more. So this becomes the largest missionary effort Joseph Smith does during his lifetime. And there hasn't quite been a missionary effort like it, proportionally at least, in any of the restoration movements. Some good came out of it. There were lots of baptisms, friendships, and even marriages. There was some growing political momentum in small places for Joseph's views, and he was able to, or his missionaries were able to, hold large meetings in New York and Boston, trying to persuade. But there were also lots of bad, difficult things. They were persecuted. They had Joseph Smith's pamphlet, which they carried with them, taken from them. It did divide some families. And of course, learning about Joseph's assassination, which ended the campaign. And in some places, it got really ugly with physical violence and other things that happened to the missionaries. And of course, the physical violence that ended up in the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. I traced these missionaries to who they were after the campaign. They're found in every branch of the restoration movement that occurred after the death of Joseph Smith. And for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where a majority of them ended up, it turns out that they were disproportionately used by church leadership in the Great Basin for the Aristarchic Theo-Democratic Zion that was built out there. In other words, they were used more than others who didn't perform this mission to be leaders, which meant also being elected to an equivalent political office, which also meant in plural marriage, marrying more wives, and greater economic opportunities. So again, just to recap, scholarship, not just by me, but by others, has now concluded that Joseph Smith ran a very serious campaign for president, but was not a serious contender. And for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the campaign and campaigners had a very serious impact on the next half of church history. Next half century, of church history. There you go.
Very good. Thank you. And well, and nicely timed. Bill Shepard, it's your turn.
I'm going to give a paragraph of each of the original 12 apostles ordained February through April 1835. Thomas B. Marsh, the oldest, excommunicated in April 1839 at Quincy, Illinois, after his withdrawing from the church after publicizing what he thought to be Mormon atrocities the previous year in Daviess County, Missouri. Rebaptized in Florence, Nebraska, made his way to Utah, where, among other things, he's humiliated by Brigham Young, and he dies in March 1859. David W. Patton was a great missionary, as were the others, known as Captain Fear Not. After massacre of Mormons at Hawn's Mill on October 24th, 1838, he was leading Mormons in a search of Missourians who he thought had kidnapped other Mormons in Daviess County when he was mortally wounded in the Battle of Crooked River. Joseph Smith said Brigham Young and Heber Kimball were the only two original apostles who never lifted their hands against him. My favorite, Lyman E. Johnson, dedicated Mormon from 1831 until he became a merchant in 1837 at Kirtland and spiraled out of the church. He drowned on the Mississippi River near Prairie du Chien on December 20th, 1859, when his horse sled went through the ice. Luke S. Johnson, like his brother Lyman, was an enthusiastic Mormon until he suffered financial losses during the banking panic of 1837, and it was excommunicated later that year. He's rebaptized in 1846, but was not reordained. He dies at Salt Lake City in 1861. Orson Pratt, the professor, a great missionary under Joseph Smith and a very talented man. He frequently differs with Brigham Young in Utah on matters such as the Adam-God doctrine. I want to plug an article that's wonderful, I think. Gary Bajera, The Orson Pratt Brigham Young Controversies, Conflict in the Quorums, 1853 to 1868, in Dialogue. And I'll send Paul the data on it. Parley P. Pratt. As I was being raised, I read the autobiography of Parley Pratt and was so enthused and wanted to be a great missionary like him. He is murdered by one Hector McLean near Alma, Arkansas in May 1857. Hector murdered Pratt for plurally marrying his estranged wife, Eleanor. William Smith was a missionary, editor, member of the Illinois legislature, and briefly a patriarch to the church. His behavior was uncontrollable in the eastern states at Nauvoo and later under James J. Strang. In 1878, he became a member of the RLDS and was a productive member. And I'm really proud of Joseph III for reining him in. John F. Boynton, a tremendous missionary, but he's going to lead the church at Kirtland when the Kirtland Bank fails in mid-1837 because he said Joseph Smith said that bank was secure by revelation. And in the banking panic, of course, it folds. And he's excommunicated a few months later. He becomes a vocal dissenter at Kirtland, and he and a few others literally drive Joseph Smith and others out of Kirtland. He later becomes a very noted inventor, geologist, and scientist. Orson Hyde. After his October 1832 baptism, he walked many hundreds of miles as a successful missionary and participated in Zion's camp. He also participated in the great 1837 mission to England and helped convert hundreds. He was disfellowshipped in Missouri in 1838 and reinstated in 1840, but that cost him seniority. The lost seniority resulted in John Taylor succeeding Brigham Young. He died at Spring City, Utah in November 1878. And my least favorite, William E. McClellan, baptized in August 1831, he quickly disrespects authority and discipline and restored several times. Yet on the other hand, he was a very intelligent man, a teacher, and multi-fashioned in obviously different ways. He's excommunicated in 1838 after he joined Missouri mobs and persecuted the saints. Post Joseph Smith, he briefly joined organizations of Sidney Rigdon, David Whitaker, James Strang, and others. And I know personally from my studies that he could be a very vicious man. He dies in Independence in 1883.
Wow. Fine summation, Brother Shepard. Thank you. And we are to James Lucas on the Zion and the Fourth Nephi.
Hey, I'm going to try to share a screen here, but I am not going to try to show any videos. Did my screen come up?
You're on.
Okay. Now let's see how we, all right. Oh, well, you know what? I'm just going to leave the side things here because I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. So my presentation looked at the end of the book of 3 Nephi and the book of 4 Nephi, focusing on Mormon's Zionic political, economic, and social analysis. Much of the presentation was based on work that Warner Woodworth and I did in a book called Working Toward Zion, which was published over 20 years ago. We basically looked at the first of all, at the Book of Mormon, noting that after the coming of Christ, that did not result in an instantaneous conversion of the whole society, but rather the book 3 Nephi tells us that it took quite a few years, or several years at least, for active proselyting and so forth for the majority of the society to become converted to the Lord. And then finally, they do succeed in creating a Christian society, which lasts for 200 years. And that's the book of 4 Nephi describes that in some detail. The main feature of which was that it had no class divisions, no tribal divisions, no tumults, and or any other manner of ites. That's a sort of a very memorable phrase from Joseph's translation. And they were able to maintain a very egalitarian sort of economy. So in my presentation, I then asked the question of Mormon's work in describing all of these social and economic developments, how much it has relevance to specific disputes of our time. And one of the main features, I showed this chart, which showed basically the progress of the human economy, or the world economy, from the beginning times to modern times. And we know that in the 1800s, there's this sharp upward jump at the time resulting from the Industrial Revolution. So Mormon, he had developed a framework of analysis of the society, and he applied this throughout his history of the Nephites, where they would become righteous. This would result in prosperity, which would result in pride, which would result in a cycle of discretion and suffering, leading them back to a state of humility and repentance. And the question became, is there a way of breaking out of that cycle? Of course, in 4 Nephi, Mormon describes the conclusion from 4 Nephi and the end of the Book of Mormon is that you can't break out of the cycle. It's a little pessimistic. He describes how the first half of the book of 4 Nephi describes this idyllic or a Christian society, but then the second half of the book of 4 Nephi describes how that society broke down and they began to be lifted up in their pride. They didn't have possessions in common anymore among them. They began to break into tribal and class distinctions, leading to the society that Mormon grew up in, which was a very contentious and divided and violent society. And that's, kind of shaped Mormon's perspective. So we then kind of concluded with the prophecies in 3 Nephi, where Jesus predicts that in our times we would suffer from the same kind of difficulties that Mormon described in his in the Book of Mormon. So what I'd like to do for my presentation here, so that's a brief summary of what I talked about, and then I talked about some things that we could do in our society to try to reduce our divisions. But I'd like to just take a few minutes and go down a different track here, and that is to leap forward to the Restoration itself and see what the Restoration has done with the lessons of the Book of Mormon. So we have this, I think people probably know this quote from Joseph from near the end of his life, that where he said, we not really differ so much in our religious views, but we could all drink into one principle of love. When the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may. So that was sort of one of the undergirding principles that Warner and I tried to analyze in our book. And so what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes and just run through a few points, kind of take a leap forward, if you will, from our Book of Mormon discussion, and leap forward to instead the question of how has the Restoration dealt with these issues that Mormon raises so vividly in the Book of Mormon. And people here are familiar with the idea of Zion. And of course, the United Order is a term that derives from efforts to come up with a more egalitarian economic system that started at the very beginning of the church, even in Kirtland. So here are a few of the, just to give a little background. So I'm going to do two quick things. One is just to look at some rhetoric from early leaders of the Restoration on these issues, and then just very briefly discuss what the early followers of the Restoration tried to do with this concept of Zion. So, of course, we know that Joseph Smith in his preaching and in the Doctrine and Covenants gave many revelations talking about the issues of taking care of the poor and helping to raise up the poor. These are all LDS Doctrine and Covenants references, but I'm fairly certain that all of these revelations will be in the RLDS or the Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants as well. I apologize, they didn't have time to look up the Community of Christ references, but I think many of these will be familiar to you because I believe they're in both of them. And, we have concepts that Joseph revealed. There's not given that one man should possess that which is above another. Unto him whom much is given, much is required. For if any man shall take the abundance and not impart to the poor, then he will lift his eyes up from hell, being in torment. So these are all, pretty strong statements that come from the very founding days of the Restoration, and which are carried forward in all the Restoration traditions very strongly. So I'd like to talk about briefly. So what do we do with this? So again, I go back to my chart and note that again we have this chart of human history, which shows this huge leap beginning in about 1870. Kind of began. This is the Industrial Revolution. Really began in England in about the 1830s and 1840s. Then it reached the United States by the 1850s, 1860s, and really began to spread throughout the world, or at least the European world, by 1870. And if you're looking at the total picture, it really starts to leap out at 1870, but it has its beginnings in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s. Now, how does that relate to the history of the Restoration? Well, interestingly enough, at that very time when the Industrial Revolution was starting to take off in Britain, that was when the first LDS missionaries were sent to Britain to begin preaching the gospel. And of course, their missions there were of enormous success. They were enormously influential in the history of the Restoration. In the 1840s, even before Joseph's death, thousands of British converts were flooding into Nauvoo. And at least I know in the Western LDS tradition that the large number of Latter-day Saints who can trace their ancestry to converts from the 1800s trace that ancestry to these British and Scandinavian converts rather than early American converts to the church. It just one can possibly underestimate the influence of the success of the British missions on the history of the Restoration. So, but another thing was, so when Warren and I were researching this, we discovered that there was another aspect to these missions that is little noted in our history, and that is that these missionaries, these largely American, John Taylor was an exception, but these missionaries arrived in Britain just as the Industrial Revolution was taking off. So they were able to witness at its birth the effects of the Industrial Revolution and its effect on society. And they commented on it. So these are names that, again, I think are familiar to most people as being early leaders of the Restoration movement from the beginnings. And so I'm just going to run through these to give you a flavor of the rhetoric that these early missionaries carried, the impact of this on these early missionaries. Wilford Woodruff, 2/3 of all revelations rest upon the accomplishment of temporal work. We cannot build Zion sitting on a hemlock slab, singing ourselves away to everlasting bliss. Rather, we have to build up the poor. Here's the Pratt brothers. Especially, I like this one from Orson. We just had some nice comments about Orson from Brother Shepard. And equity and inequality of property is the root and foundation of innumerable evils, he says. It tends to derision and to keep asunder the social feelings. Here's John Taylor. And it was interesting because so they were very keenly aware of the inequality that the Industrial Revolution was producing. And they're also very keenly aware of the elements that made the Industrial Revolution, this economic revolution, happen. So when they talked about financiering, here's John Taylor on financiering. Financier for the poor, he says, for the working man. It requires labor. This is your calling. It's not to build up yourselves, but to build up the church and the kingdom of God. Do not let us leave anybody crying for bread, suffering for want of employment. Let us furnish employment for all, says John Taylor.
James, let me interrupt. I'm wondering if we shouldn't have scheduled you for another presentation.
Well, I'll get to that. I'll be done in just a minute here, and then we can talk about if we'd like to pursue this discussion. So anyway, here's Lorenzo Snow, who says that men and women of worth should use their riches to give employment to the laborer. So in other words, wealth should be used to benefit all. Joseph F. Smith, Hiram's son, was Joseph III's cousin, and that's a fascinating relationship to study. Had this rather famous expression that if you cannot, a religion that cannot save people temporarily cannot save them spiritually. So just to conclude my little quick summary here, now I'm going to speak here to the Utah tradition, but I acknowledge with great interest that this talk of Zion and these talk of economic justice and so forth was very strong in the reorganized tradition as well. I believe Fred M. Smith especially was very much engaged in the interest in Zion, and that this kind of rhetoric and concern continued very strongly in the other restoration traditions as well. And one thing that would be interesting would be to hear somebody speak to how the Zion concept would carry forward in the reorganized tradition and some of the other restoration traditions. But in any event, to conclude here, I mean, I'm trying to summarize a discussion that is several hundred pages long in our book, so I apologize, I'm running out of bed. But what we discovered was that these early apostles who had been missionaries in Britain then became the leaders of the LDS, the Utah Church, and they engaged in extremely strong efforts in the 1870s and 1880s into the 1890s to institute the Zion concepts. And there were over 400 different types of United Order cooperative economic ventures started in Utah, and they varied widely. They were co-ops, like we might see today. Some of them were communal co-ops that kind of covered the entire community, like in St. George. Others were very, all-encompassing rural agricultural co-ops, very similar to kibbutzes, which actually had their origins at about the same time, like Orderville. And so there was a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of thought that went into trying to reestablish the idea of a United Order Zion in Utah in those times. But those efforts collapsed due to a number of reasons. Some of them were political and external. Some of them were internal and involved individual people. But the heritage, the Zion heritage, remains strong, I think, throughout the Restoration. And I think we, can look back to Mormons' strong interest in these issues in the Book of Mormon as being one of the power generators, one of the power sources of this movement. So anyway, I will stop for now, and I will maybe discuss this some more in the question and answer. And certainly, I'm very open to having further discussions about this in our forum.
Thank you. Let's proceed then to Mike Riggs. Tell us about your views expressed in the Huntsville's Hamlet.
Oh, all right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do I need to? I don't have any PowerPoint. Sorry.
You want me to put up the old one? I can do that if you.
No, that's fine.
Okay, just talk. Tell them what you think. You're muted. Mike, you're muted.
Okay.
Try
Am I
that.
there?
Yeah, now we got it.
Okay. Well, I thought a couple of things I wanted to talk about real quick. The importance of documenting our work, even though it was done, we didn't document it until many years after we had finished the project. But it was still important to do that because we had worked on it for 5 years and we had produced a lot of artifacts and a lot of information that we needed to share. So it was great. When we did get back to discussing it and writing this, to work together with Paul again. We've always been friends and stayed in touch, but we actually really worked very closely on this project. And we have a second one Paul probably mentioned, which is the C.C. Rich and Joseph Rich 1837 log house that we worked 3 years at to do that archaeological investigation. That is a work that's also in process and will be part of the John Whitmer archaeology monograph series as well. We wanted to, I think there's multiple benefits to this book, and I'll just talk about several of them. I know Paul talked about the students and the pedagogy of it. That's great. But one thing is that a casual tourist coming to the site might not understand that site has changed a lot since the 1830s. That's due to modern farming practices starting in the 1920s and erosion and deposition of material from Shoal Creek. Paul probably talked about some of the finds that we made at really substantial depths, things like a diaper or a Zarda cottage cheese lid, and things like that. So it showed us that there had been a lot of material that had been dumped on that site. So it didn't look the same as what it would have been back then. So hopefully our book will give the visitor a little better perspective on what they're experiencing. We got into, there are a lot of things in history that we think are true that aren't, or are partially true, things like that. And I used this one illustration of nits become lice because it's probably one of the most quoted things when you think of Hawn's Mill. Nits become lice when Sardius Smith's head was shot off. And but as I dug into that story deeper, I realized that it was not as clear cut on who did it, not only who did it, what was said, when it was said, things like that. And I did it as an illustration to kind of show the art in the archaeology is that, there's a lot of preconceived notions. And, is what my biblical archaeology teacher used to say in college. She said, the truth lies below. You have to go and dig it up and to get to the truth. And so that was part of that. Also, things that are commonly believed that aren't true are, that Governor Boggs's extermination order was the thing that precipitated the attack at Hawn's Mill. It's not the case. Alex Baugh and I have worked on this over the years independently, but have verified it. One of the things that I'd like to point out was that if it was a license to kill, why didn't the regulators who were going through the county after Hawn's Mill warning people out? They were saying, Governor Boggs says you got to go, but they weren't killing them. They were just saying, you got to go. Governor says you got to go. And I pointed out one time, and Alex was like, wow, I think you're right. That if Governor Boggs's extermination order had come in time, it might have stopped that massacre because they were frustrated. They felt like nothing's happening. And if the governor had acted and said, we're going to get rid of the people, then they would have probably stood down and not done it. So there are a lot of things like that we hopefully this book kind of helps set the record a little straighter on some of these things. Joseph Young's group, they had been part of Kirtland Camp, and they left on July 4th in around July 4th from Kirtland in 1838. And as they were traveling down to Missouri, the whole Mormon War was happening during their whole trip. And so they get to, there was a small group of them with Joseph Young who had kind of fragmented off, and they were stopped in Hawn's Mill, being, the wrong place at the wrong time. They just happened to be at the wrong place. And Sardius was, who Nitz become Lice kid who died, he was actually part of that group. But so it just sort of showed that this whole time of this war went very quickly in reality through their trip coming down. Paul was able to point out the Potawatomi Trail, which paralleled their trek that they came down, and the parallels between, the showing the marginalization of people is a great comparison, and you can see that in the book. Finally, I'll point out that we suggest that our work is important, but it also is just a start. Really, there's a lot more that could be done at Hawn's Mill. It's now owned by the LDS Church. Not when we were doing the work there, it was owned by the Community of Christ. It's now owned by the LDS Church. So it'd be up to them to do whatever gets done. But we hope our work would be helpful. But there's a lot more that could be discovered there if people would do that work. We also suggest that other sites, such as Guyman's Horse Mill, which is near Kingston today, and the Maribome settlement, which is just over the line in Davies County, and it's also associated with the Littlefields halfway house. It was halfway between Adirondack and Far West. Those sites areas could be archaeological work could be done there too, and to the end that we would learn more about those sites, but we also would get more artifacts that could be compared with what we found at Hawn's Mill. And also in our book, we talk about Adirondack, the dig that Ray Matheny and Lamar Barrett had done back in the late 70s up there. We got access to their report. And so we were able to talk about some of that. And the more information that we would have on these various sites, it would just give us more data to look at things like where these goods were coming in from, how things were being distributed into the area. This was very rural at the time. And it turns out that mostly the non-Mormons and the Mormons were getting a lot of their stuff from the same places. But anyway, I think we could learn more from that. So that was kind of, if that's 5 minutes, I'll call it good.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we only have two more because I haven't seen Casey Griffiths. If he is on, have you seen him, Deb? He's the one that gave us the relics, showed us the seer stone and that kind of thing that are in his two books about relics of Mormonism. All right, then we're back to John Mueller on the high priests. I did see John, yes. Need to unmute, John.
Okay, I'm unmuted. And I need to bring up that and share screen. Okay, do you have?
We're not seeing your screen yet. There it comes.
There you are.
There you go.
Okay.
Go.
I was talking about the necessary ministry of the high priest in the restoration. And this question arose to me because of how the Bible describes such a limited and restricted focused ministry of the high priest, especially in the Old Testament and after New Testament times, that office disappeared. So I was wondering why we still had it. And therefore, I've asked two questions. Why does the community of Christ and its predecessors, including the Mormons, consider the office of high priest as fundamental to all Melchizedek priesthood functions? And what should be the focus of the high priest's ministry today? And the answer to me is found in the scriptures, and that's the order. You can see the order in which I'm going through it. In the Old Testament, particularly in Genesis, two people stand out. We have Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High. We have Jethro, the priest of Midian, who became the father-in-law of Moses. I could talk a lot longer on these characters, but not tonight. And generally, after Exodus in the Old Testament, all the references to priest or high priest describe a sacrificial or judicial role within the Aaronic priesthood ministry through the tribe of Levi. And there was only a single high priest at any one time and no high priesthood. And similarly, sacrifice in the Old Testament was all part of the law and was ritualistic, worshipful, and there was no evidence in my readings of a human sacrifice practiced by Israel, although some people might wonder about Abraham and Isaac, or others might wonder about Elijah and the prophets of Baal, but if you look more carefully, there was no human sacrifice there. Moving to the Book of Mormon, we have high priests, high priesthood, and so forth, and sacrifice all mentioned a number of times. And human sacrifice is only mentioned once in the Book of Mormon, chapter 2, and that was to idols. Although in Alma, we find a lot more detail about high priests, and we see the phrase the high priesthood of the holy order of God, and later it's described as eternal, identified with Melchizedek, and emphasizes teaching. If you're curious, the numbers I've given there in parentheses are the RLDS version, or the Community of Christ version, and the square brackets are the LDS versions for all these scripture references. And then in Alma 16, we have the foretelling of the Christ's offering of his life as the last and great and last sacrifice for sin. And later, in Jesus' own preaching ministry to the people, we find that he says, "Ye shall offer for a sacrifice unto me a broken heart and a contrite spirit." Looking in the New Testament, we find almost all this is references back to the Jewish religious and civil life in Israel. But there are exceptions, and two I'm going to point out carefully. Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 1. It talks about presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, and that we are supposed to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And then in First Peter 2, we find that we are to be built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And in the book of Hebrews, which is a rather long and worthwhile read, it discusses the whole role of Jesus Christ as a high priest forever, acknowledges openly that Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, had no Levitical priesthood authority, but still is high priest. And so they boldly combine a couple verses out of Psalms to present Jesus as the Son of God and a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, which is a much earlier pre-Aaronic role. And then chapters 6 to 10 continue to make it clear that for all people and all time as a new covenant. And the Doctrine and Covenants, in harmony with Hebrews 7, there are two orders of priesthood, the lesser, which is the Aaronic, and the greater, which is the Melchizedek. And these are well described in Doctrine and Covenants 83. In section 109 of the Doctrine and Covenants, we find the power and authority of the Melchizedek priesthood. And there's about 8 bullet point terms you could look at up, but in general, they all go far beyond the bounds of this world. So, to answer the first question, The office of Melchizedek high priest has always been in God's ministry plan, and God has this office in the Restoration Church now. Moving on, what should be the high priest's ministry? As I've said, the bulk of the biblical history is focused on blood sacrifice, which has ended. We have the focus in the Book of Mormon mostly on being a judge and a church leader, although they do have the Melchizedek high priest there. And with a few exceptions, such as I have cited a few moments ago, almost everything else in the Doctrine and Covenants is discussing history, an administrative function of the high priest. So there has to be more. And that brings us to the whole topic of Zion, which I'm so glad to hear it brought up already this evening. It's mentioned over 400 times in the scriptures. And one of those mentions that stands out says, "And the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind, and they dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them." That's D&C 36, or in the Pearl of Great Price. And those points are important. One heart and one mind, living in righteousness, and having no poor among you. And those have been the goal, as was mentioned a few minutes ago by another speaker tonight, for many of the attempts to create Zionic conditions in business, religious, ministerial organizations in Missouri, in Utah, and elsewhere. But perhaps we need to go back and revisit those two scriptures I pointed out earlier in Romans and 1 Peter. We have to become a living sacrifice and be transformed in our mind. And we have to be offering spiritual sacrifices. And in that, I think we find the answer to our second question. The high priest's ministry is to lead us to become living spiritual sacrifices. This is a willingness to give all that we are and all we have to the will of God, so the conditions of Zion can occur. And so in conclusion, I will say simply, we need the full ministry of the high priest today, so we can become living spiritual sacrifices at this time when the conditions of Zion are so desperately needed in the world. Thank you.
Wow, good summation. And finally, we're to Val Larsen, for the parallels that he found between Messiah and Zeniff.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen here. Are you all seeing where it says review session?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I talked about how the Book of Mosiah is organized as a set of contrasts between two dynasties. The dynasty of King Messiah, which had Messiah being compared to Zeniff, and that's the main thing I focused on. This paper also talks about Benjamin. No, we didn't talk about that. 2 King Messiah and Limhi. The Book of Messiah is also a set of nested narratives. So it starts out with King Messiah and Benjamin. It ends with King Messiah and Benjamin. And then in the middle, it talks about how miserable the people of Zeniff have become. This is Limhi and his people who were the people of Zeniff. And that frames then the middle story of Zeniff, Noah and Abinadi, and the first Alma. And what's interesting, right here where this blue arrow is located, Limhi, who's in misery with his people, sings the importance and cites scriptures on the importance of having a seer and a prophet and of listening to them. And God condemns the people for not listening to their prophet. So that happens just before the story of Zeniff starts. And Zeniff is going to be an example of somebody who didn't listen to a prophet. So we get this contrast between the first Messiah, who led the people out of the land of Nephi, and then Zeniff leads them back. And point by point, God's hand is in leading Messiah and his people out of the land of Nephi. Zeniff, there's no God involved with Zeniff leading them back, and a lot of bad stuff happens on the way. It should have given them a clue maybe that this wasn't a good idea. So when they get back, you essentially, the reason God led them out is because they had a situation that's essentially, to put it in contemporary terms, the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's where they were when God told the Messiah, look, we've had yet generations of killing on either side. I'm going to lead you out of this land to stop the killing. And Zeniff initially went with them, but then he came back. And what's interesting is Zeniff, when he comes back, he started out as a humane, peace-loving person. He saw good in the Lamanites. Here in the blue, I saw that which was good among them, and I was desirous that they should not be destroyed. He was sent as a spy by his austere and bloodthirsty leader. By the end of this story, down here at the bottom, I have Zeniff's actions. I sent my spies. He's just like the bloodthirsty man sending out spies so that he can kill the Lamanites more effectively. He's describing the Lamanites now, and he sees them the same way his former leader saw them. They have an eternal hatred toward the children of Nephi. He leads his people in remorselessly slaughtering the Lamanites, and they don't count them. They don't seem to mourn them at all. And he's lost all of his pity and love even for the Lamanites, because he didn't follow the prophet. God had taken them away from a disastrous circumstance, and he led himself back into it. And ironically, when the Lamanites first attack, he and his people call upon God to deliver them from their danger that they're in. And of course, God had already delivered them from the danger they were in when he had Messiah lead them out of that land, and then they came back to it voluntarily. So that's kind of the thing that we tend to do. When I was at the conference on the Book of Mormon this past week, one of the people there, Kylie Turley, pointed out that this rhetoric that Zeniff has, what I've got down here in the red at the bottom, had earlier been used by Enos. So in the book of Enos, you see Enos describing the Lamanites, saying their hatred was fixed, and in identical words, they became a wild and ferocious and bloodthirsty people. They were continually seeking to destroy us. That's exactly the same conclusion that Zeniff comes to after he turns away from his belief that there was good among the Lamanites. And up at the top, it's kind of blocked out, but the thought that came to me is that sometimes we get a kind of structural sociological dynamic going between peoples, and the will of the individual ceases to have much of an effect. It's just there's a social dynamic that starts to determine everything. So Enos actually had a lot of positive goodwill toward the Lamanites. He praised for their ultimate salvation. And Zeniff had goodwill toward the Lamanites, and yet the social dynamic that had developed between the Lamanites and the Nephites, their mutual ideologies and how they saw each other, made it so that all they were going to get when they were together was bloodshed and slavery and just misery. And we're seeing exactly that play out, I think, in the state of Israel this week, is the ideologies on both sides. I personally don't see them as being balanced, but there's no doubt that there's plenty of bad being done to people on both sides. And I think it's about as clear of an example of we could find in the world today of what God tried to lead Messiah and his people out of, and then what Zeniff voluntarily went back to, only to see then 3 generations of misery before they were again delivered out of the land of Nephi. And that concludes my presentation, or review rather.
Well, thank you. And you just answered the question I wanted to lay out first for everyone. And that question was, what does your presentation offer to our better understanding of the situation in Israel today? And I think you just addressed that very nicely. And so I would defer and invite other people that have presented to address that matter if they would. Any lesson that you can derive from your presentation to the situation with the Israelis and the Palestinians? And by the way, if you'd like to go to the reactions and raise your hand, then we'll turn over to Deb to monitor who's next in line, because we're open for questions and answers. Anyone care to respond to my overall question?
Can we have a stop to the screen share?
You want to screen share?
No, stop the
Oh,
screen
sorry.
share.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry.
There.
I was trying
Yeah,
to figure out why I
let's
couldn't see on my screen.
Yeah,
That was
back to
my-
the open forum.
That's my doing. Yeah.
Okay. John, you wanted to speak to it?
Yeah, I stuck a brief message in the chat. Which basically what you were sharing with us, Brother Larsen, was what biblical scholars call a chiasm, where you have sequences A, then B, then C, and then you have the reverse sequence, C prime, B prime, A prime, and they just sort of all nest together in that fashion. And this method of writing, which was very common in scripture, was hardly recognized or understood until the last 100 years or so in biblical scholarship. And so finding it in the Book of Mormon certainly is significant.
The Book of Mormon is clear as chock full of chiasms. That's true.
Okay. Looks like we got Terry and then James. Go ahead, please, Terry.
I just have a comment that comes from a friend of mine, Larry Zimmerman, that Paul might know him, who taught at the University of South Dakota. And it's a comment that his wife made in relation to interpreting archaeological data, because nobody that we study is there to ask questions. And so his wife said that everything that Larry did was science fiction. And so I get a kick out of that, describing all the archaeological interpretations we make.
By the way, I was just writing about you today. I think it was science fiction that the Times and Seasons was the 14th site that you worked on in Nauvoo.
Yes.
Was it 13th? It was 14th.
14, yeah.
All right. Well, and that's sort of a fiction too. All right. Thank you, Terry.
James, go ahead, please.
Well, to go to Paul's point, I think that we have kind of backing a little bit away from the specific focus of my presentation, but I think that we can see in the relationship between the the Jews and the Israelis and the Palestinians a vivid parallel to the Book of Mormon. I mean, there was tension from the beginning amongst the Lehites, but there was also a common origin and a common bond. And when the Jews started to return to Palestine, there was tension, but there was not there was accommodation as well. And we see the growing animosity between Israelis and Palestinians, and it's just hard not to think of this pattern of how the Lamanites and the Nephites, from common origins, some divisions, but also a lot of commonalities, just grew into hereditary enemies and ultimately, destroyed each other, or one was destroyed and the others was, driven into a sad and unrighteous state. So, and again, as I said, the Book of Mormon doesn't offer. I mean, it offers a solution, but the solution, of course, is a radical one. You have to change your entire worldview and your entire way of thinking. And short of that, it tells us that this is just going to be the pattern of human society. And we look at our headlines today and we think of Israelis and Palestinians, but there's hundreds of other examples of tribal and ethnic and national rivalries that just take a huge, it's just a natural course of it seems of human nature to focus on division and enmity as opposed to commonality, and you have to just do something really amazing and overwhelming to overcome that. So, like, to just, if I could, one example that offers a little bit of hope, if you will, is in Western Europe, where the French and the Germans had developed a very bitter rivalry with major wars over quite a period of time. And it only was after the tragedy of World War II and the very positive, active efforts to create a European Union or a European community that the deep-seated personal rivalries between the French and the Germans began to abate. So having lived in France, I can say that, they certainly aren't completely abated. You still have a lot of prejudice, but at least there's a sign that it is possible to overcome these kinds of deep-seated rivalries, but doesn't happen naturally. It has to come through the active imposition of some, higher ethic. So anyway, that would be my comment on it.
Thank you.
Okay, Val, go ahead, please.
At the Book of Mormon Studies Association, there was a presentation on the Book of Mormon's discussion of money, and it's related to Jim's presentation and John's presentation, both of them about Zion. Somebody posed the question, is there any evidence that the Book of Mormon's had an effect on how we live our lives today? And the answer to that is yes, because the biggest concentration of followers of the Restoration in any given locale is in Utah. Utah has, there's a measure of income dispersion called the Gini coefficient, which if it has a 1, it means one person has all the wealth. If it has a 0, it means the wealth is equally distributed among the population. Among the United States, Utah has the lowest Gini coefficient, the lowest income distribution. And I think that's a direct effect of the Book of Mormon's teachings about Zion. And the community of Christ isn't as large in its areas, it's kind of spread around some different states, and it may be that the community of Christ cities or places where you're concentrated, or certainly among your people, might have a similar kind of effect. We can't see it because it's not isolated one state, but I think this doctrine of Zion and what the Book of Mormon teaches about, and the Joseph Smith teachings that Jim mentioned, has had an effect on our people and how we live our lives. There's some evidence of that. That was my comment.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, Terry, go ahead, please.
This Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a perfect match to the Book of Mormon peoples, because when the Hebrews left Egypt and they moved into that area, they displaced the Canaanites. And then I was reading the Old Testament a couple of years ago, and it dawned on me that those people, those Hebrews who defected because they were told repeatedly, don't marry outside of the church. Some of them did. And so those people, basically, the mixture of those who left the 12 tribes basically and mixed with the Canaanites, those are who the Palestinians are today. If you look at the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites, 400 years after they got to the New World or wherever they went, immense hatred for the Nephites, even though they'd mixed a lot. And so the older those traditions became, the more nasty the rivalries became. And that's why the Nephites were basically wiped out. And what we know as the Lamanites continued on. So it's a perfect match of the roller coaster that those the two groups in those two areas have lived through millennia, basically.
The idea of extending our traditions of hate is a good way to wipe out it's a remarkable demonstration of dysfunctionality of our human family. Yeah, good parallel, Terry. Thank you. I want to nudge Derek here just a moment, because I think I see political parallels, and I was anticipating he would want to jump on one.
Well, I think the thing that I would mention about this would be that the idea that come from the revelations surrounding Zion's camp and a few others about the Constitution and its role in safeguarding human rights, basically the Bill of Rights, and that it in two different places the revelations quote that it's for all flesh or for all mankind, and we saw an attempt to try and do that, I think, earlier in this century in Iraq, to kind of enforce or try and create something like that. But I don't think that's going to work, trying to do that. I think there has to be some kind of underpinning. And I'm not saying it needs to be Christianity or it needs to be Latter-day Saint restoration theology, but there has to be some kind of underpinning of belief that all life matters, and that differences in religiosity do not equate to hatred, and there has to be a willingness to. I think we're seeing echoes of this in our own nation right now, where fewer and fewer people are willing to listen to completely and want to work together with and compromise and moderate on positions to move us forward as a nation. These are obviously two different nation groups, and they're two different ethno groups, but they certainly aren't looking. They're certainly not listening completely to one another. At the same time, in Israel, which is a democracy with a constitution, there is greater protection of human rights. And so there is something about the idea of some kind of constitutional law, regardless of whether it's based on a religious tradition. So for the Jewish state, whether it's based on British common law and ideals from Enlightenment thinkers like in the United States or whatever, that there is something to be said of some form of constitutional government that allows for the practice of freedom of religion and the practice of protecting and enforcing the rights of others.
Very good, and thank you. I'd like to put Bill Shepard on the spot also, because it seems to me that the factionalism that developed out of that early Quorum of 12, with some, well, so many of them got expelled from the church. There was a good deal of division, and yet they at least began with some very powerful common beliefs. And yet there should be a lesson, I think, there from how we learn to live with each other, deal with each other, so that we can treat each other more equitably. Perhaps I'm fishing too hard for something that doesn't exist. But Bill, if you'd like to comment, I want to give you the chance.
I kind of look to Joseph Smith, and probably, unlike at least some people that I know in my church feel that Joseph Smith was a perfect individual, that he didn't do anything wrong and so forth like this. I look at Joseph Smith as being human, a person who made mistakes. Certainly James Strang made mistakes. I guess it kind of starts with the leadership being imperfect in my idea. There's some really neat people that in the first 12 apostles, David W. Patton, who Captain Fear Not, and yet he was intolerant in different ways. Thomas B. Marsh was the story about his wife's milk strippings, which possibly is just fable. But if it is true that Thomas B. Marsh got his nose out of joint because the church ruled against his wife, human people, I admire Brigham Young and Heber Kimball for being strict. Joseph, as I mentioned, Joseph Smith says they're the only one of the 12 apostles that never raised their hand against me. I look at Lyman Johnson, who's such a human person, but yet he couldn't stick to it. He comes back from a mission in 1837, and he sees, and Heber Kimball talks about it. Kimball says, I came back and there was at Kirtland, there was all this money floating around, and people were lifted up, and they were all and buying on credit. And Lyman Johnson took 5 missions, 5 extended missions, and he was solid until possibly Joseph did things at Kirtland. Maybe the Joseph's promise about that the Kirtland Bank could never fail, and so forth like this. So I really like these people, most of them certainly. But I see so much humanity in each one of these people. And the early Mormons, in my estimation, were not all saints. They were simply human people doing the best they could do.
Wow, if we give people credit for that today, then well, it's tough when the best we can do is fight and kill each other. We have a long ways to go. And I think I saw Blair raising a hand.
I was just thumbs up with what Bill Russell said.
Bill Shepard.
Bill Russell, Shepard, yeah, sorry.
Both of them good old timers.
But this is Shepard.
All right.
All right. Val, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the hopeful German French thing that Jim gave us. Another one is the Brighamites and the Josephites, the LDS and the Community of Christ. We used to be at odds much more than we are today. And it's been, and all the different restoration traditions have come together in a much more friendly and amicable way than was true. It's very evident here. It's evident at the Book of Mormon Studies Association, various places that we meet together, the history and so forth. And I think that's been in the spirit of the restoration that we've been able to do that.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that, and thank you for participating here, because clearly the intent of this forum is to provide that kind of a framework. So yeah, even though we've had 6 different presentations on where the land of Nephi is, and every one of them is confident and convincing, Yeah, that's all right. Let's get all the information out and let people look at it. Oh, what fun. And thank you all for the presentations and review tonight. But the floor should be open for all of you to ask questions. And Mike, I think, has disappeared. So any questions you should have on the Hansville thing would fall to me. But since I get to ask questions too, then I'll probably avoid that. This conflict that we're seeing between Israel and Palestine is so bloody and so, to me, unnecessary. And yet, internationally, we justify the Israelis because they were unjustly attacked. And yet, here we look at Russia and Ukraine, unjustified attack, and we have a significant portion of our own population that's saying we should reduce or eliminate funding. I appreciate the comments about the nature of leadership, because the nature of leadership does make a difference. And the Book of Mormon, I think, illustrates that repeatedly, showing that if you can have good leaders, your prospects are so much better than if you have those that are pushing for their own enhancement and the enhancement of a small group. Tyranny does not work well. Floor is open. Wednesday, you've been quiet this evening. That's not characteristic for you.
Yeah, hello.
Hey, Wednesday.
I mean, I've been heartbroken today, and as well as last night. I have a lot of dear friends who are Palestinian and who have family in Gaza. And I mourn the lives lost in Israel as well. But I'm particularly concerned about the Gazans because they are in what's essentially an open air prison. They're guarded by land and by sea and by air. They're having food and water cut, and I just think they're talking about get out of Gaza, or are we going to reduce things to rubble? Well, you can't get out of Gaza, not very easily, and so my thoughts are with them, my prayers are with them, and I'm kind of looking for, I don't know what action I can personally take. I've been talking to people about dehumanization online because I've been noticing a lot of dehumanization of people when talking about this conflict, and also when talking about the war with Russia and Ukraine. People tend to dehumanize the side that they're not on. But it's just, I don't know, it's been on my mind that it's just really important to remember that all people involved in the conflict and all people, whatever horrific things are done by humans. Because when we start to dehumanize people and compare them to bestial creatures, it becomes a lot easier to do horrible things. I know that's not a question, but that's where my mind has been.
Well, thank you for your compassionate comment. I appreciate that this is a forum in which people can share their feelings, and while we may not agree politically, there's room for us to share our humanity and appreciate that there is something of God in each of us. Looking ahead, next week we have Bill Shepard coming back to One Mighty and Strong. And then we have Richard Saunders. What is that topic? It looks like that's authority and scripture. And then David DeBarthe will be sharing the Nauvoo swamp. I'll be sharing that with him, but yeah, we've been writing an article about the swamp in Nauvoo, and so using the archaeological and geological background to dispute that claim. And then we have Terry Walker putting together a session on miracles and testimonies. And so I'm not sure, Terry, if you want to get the floor and invite people to contact you or anything else on that. And then we have Mike Nielsen coming on the early RLDS rituals, Wanda Stubbert on eye syndrome, and Robert Messick is coming back on the Book of Mormon. What is that? If you read my writing, it would help. Curses, maybe? And then we have one more open spot before the next review. And then we're in December as well. So we've got the next couple of months covered. But what an interesting variety, as you can see on the review this evening, what an interesting variety of topics we've been addressing. And yet this evening we come back to this fundamental commonality that the things of the dysfunctional family of man expressed in the Book of Mormon have a lot to apply to the modern world. Yes, Deb?
What's that?
You're asking for the floor?
No.
You should be.
Paul, if I could just add something,
Yes, sure.
you mentioned that the research I've started on mine is going to be from the LDS perspective, because that's what I am. But I think there's probably very little or no difference between what Community of Christ or any of the other restoration groups see as miracles. At least I hope not. So if anybody has something that they can add in there, that would be nice, because I was going to ask that on my presentation, that if anybody has specific examples of important miracles in their life, go ahead and share, because my presentation, I think, will not be that long, so there'll be a lot of airtime for personal additions there.
Well, let me give you an update on Abigail Barnes, because I have for 2 months been asking you to pray for her. I talked with her Saturday. I talked with her father on Wednesday, and her father's report was that the doctor who examined the MRI last was amazed to discover that the fluid on her brain has dissipated, and her prospects of a full recovery are dramatically improved. And we're seeing a miracle as this young lady who spent a month in a coma now is talking, walking, and reclaiming her life in a beautiful manner.
Deb's going to be able to chime in on that one, because I heard her interview with Rick Bennett, and she had some great miracle stories to tell. So I know there's at least one person on here who's got miracles to talk about.
If it's not too repetitious, I probably will.
No. Yeah, I would hope that people would feel free to share, because, yeah, even though sometimes we're a little bit suspicious of ourselves in sharing such things, I believe that it's worthwhile for us to recognize that there are unexplained developments in our history and in our religious thinking that sometimes merit to be shared.
One of the things I've come across repeatedly is that one of the purposes of miracles is to strengthen your testimony and your belief in God. So if that's what it does, it works.
Well, I'm for that.
I have a quick question. Just to Val, this is a little bit just more on the chit chat point, but I've been so busy lately. I guess I completely was the BOM this last week.
Yes, it was. Yeah, had some
great
presentations there.
Missed it. Did you present?
I didn't present, but I did invite a lot of the presenters, or ask a lot of the presenters if they'd be willing to come here. And there were some superb presentations, and hopefully a number of them indicated they'd be willing to come on and share stuff here.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully we'll be able to hear some of them in the spring, maybe.
And let the rest of you take note of that, because here's Val going to a conference where he years people giving presentations that might very well fit the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. And so to get those contacts so that we can hear them in the future, that's altogether appropriate. I appreciate the support. I appreciate every time that happens. And because I don't just dream these topics up, somehow we find these people and their research is so fascinating. And so to have the chance to share it means that the whole network of us needs to continue to expand in order to be able to provide the broader network by which our forum can be successful. Oh, and I have been approached multiple times to see about getting presentations on YouTube, and I'm not I'm not comfortable or competent to take care of that. So if there's anyone with that kind of background that would like to volunteer to help make that happen, I would be very interested in getting that assistance.
Could you repeat that, getting these on YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, I might be able to help with that. Like I could maybe work on captioning or something, but we can talk.
All right, well, great. Robert Cook has the full list of our presentations over the last 3+ years. Not all have been recorded, particularly the first couple of months we did not record, or we had some people who chose not to be recorded. And then I also messed up on recordings when I was trying to take care of that as well as the hosting. But to be able to have the later ones, that people that are willing, we've had some really awesome presentations, a lot of them, many of them memorable in my view, and to make them available so they could be more widely shared, I think would be appropriate. Roger Gilbert has his hand up.
Yeah, Paul, I was talking to you guys about that last week, and I did start a channel, a preliminary channel that I want to be able to review with you and Robert, a YouTube channel. So,
wow, you got one started.
Yeah, I got 8 of them loaded, and I can see them right now. In fact, I think you even can, but I don't have them organized the way you want them yet. But it was just a start from our discussion last week, and I think it's the direction we want to go. But so if you pull up, I just named it Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. You can go to that, and you can see, I think, 8 videos on there that I've loaded, but they need some work, a little bit of cleanup probably. But anyway, it was kind of the preliminary I wanted to share with you guys.
Well, thank you. Wow. Isn't that neat how here I make the request and people are already stepping into it? This is a beautiful bunch. Oh, I love volunteers. I love volunteers. It was fascinating back in 1980 when I was working with volunteers on the Mansion House, and Ray Matheny brought his crew from Adamantiaman over, and Rena fed them all, and we had a good meal, good visit. They dug in what we're doing. Matter of fact, the Carters came back and spent a week with us digging on our Mansion House site just for fun because they had archaeological experience. And Rena and I went over to Adamantiaman to check to see what they were doing, and they had such remarkable technology. They had subsurface radar. They had 25 sites they were working on, and they had funding. That's something that I never had. And so to be able to see what my volunteers were doing as compared to that more professional kind of crew made me awfully proud of what my volunteers were accomplishing. And I still feel that way. Those of us working here as volunteers, I think, are the kind of people that make Zion happen. The good kind of Zion happen. And Monty's trying to get on. Deb, you're back in charge here.
Okay, Monty and then James. Go ahead, Monty. Nice to see you.
Well, we can't see you, Monty, and so it might be a bit nicer if we don't.
No. Are you there, Monty?
You need to unmute.
Okay, we'll come. Oh, there he is.
It scooted away from me. I just wanted to tell you that I promise you guys I never intended for my humor to go worldwide.
Well, why not?
Those are-
People laugh all around the world.
Those were just poor jokes intended for you guys.
Well, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to scrub you out of our recordings for all these years, Monty.
Well, it's too late to pull them back now, but I mean, it's just I'm going to have to worry about being recognized on street corners, and I don't dodge bricks very well anymore. So,
Oh, that may just be the appropriate sacrifice to make. I mean, here we're talking about John Mueller was telling us we need to be offering the sacrifice, and that may be appropriate for you. I'll try to shield you a little bit, but your humor is worth a lot. Thank you
of
for
course,
being
I've heard of stoning, but I may be the world's first bricking.
Okay.
Okay, James, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't mean to load work onto Terry, but the subject of miracles is a fascinating one. So this is just a suggestion, but if you're interested in kind of, if you will, polling the other restoration traditions for material on that subject, we've had occasionally a participant on our group here named Josh Gailey from the Church of Jesus Christ, which is the nickname is the Bickertonites. And I have seen him on a number of podcasts. He's made himself quite active on a number of podcasts in recent times. And he has told a number of interesting, very, very inspiring stories about miracles that have occurred in his restoration group. So I don't have his contact information, but like I say, somebody here may, because he has participated here in the Perspectives Forum in the past. So if you're interested in kind of doing a survey of the restoration groups and miracles, I would suggest him as a possible contact. Might have some interesting material to contribute to what you're looking at.
I do have his contact information, Terry, and he has actually got a very powerful testimony of his own. Josh does, in regards to his little girl, who he shared that with us on the forum at one point. So if you'd like, I can send you that, or I can look it up. And put it in
Is
chat.
he the one that was raised at Bickertonite but has his own church now, but still believes in the Book of Mormon? Is that the man you're talking about?
No, Josh Gailey is. He is
Actively. No, he's an official of the
He's an
Bickertonite
evangelist.
Church. His
Okay.
father's the president.
All right.
But thank you, James. I concur. Josh Gailey would be an excellent person to invite into that forum.
I think there's two possibilities here. When Paul asked me to do it, the idea was miracles in the Book of Mormon. And so that's where I've tried to focus so far. But one thing that you can't separate is how that has affected various parts of the restoration. And that may be a good thing to have another time. I'll see when I get this other thing done what happens, but that's where I'm focusing on the Book of Mormon initially.
But let me share one. I was impressed. I was pleased at the John Whitmer Historical Association with a number of factors, but one thing very special to me was the chance to have dinner with Dan Whittemore and his wife. Dan Whittemore and his wife have visited 100 countries for a week each, and I think it's taken them 50 years to do that. But what a remarkable goal and accomplishment! He's also the one who funds the best book and best article award each year. And we had dinner together, and in the process of our chat, he mentioned that his grandfather was Joe Carr. And so I directly faced him and asked if perchance that was the same Joe Carr who lived 1 mile south of Limhi, Iowa, on the west side of Highway 69. And his eyes got big. you knew my grandpa? And sure enough, I knew his grandpa. His grandpa was a profound minister. And I shared with him the experience that my father, who was pastor at the Lone Rock congregation, a little country congregation in northern Missouri, had shared. We walked into Ethel Johnson's house one Sunday afternoon. Ethel Johnson was an Australian Aborigine lady who somehow had gotten married to Mr. Johnson in northern Missouri up in the Lone Rock area and raised their family on a farm. She was badly crippled with arthritis, so badly that she could only hold a needle between her knuckles to sew. She was bedfast. I remember feeling so sorry for her. But one day we walked into her room on Sunday afternoon, and she waved at Dad and smiled at him and said, "Joe, that was an awesome sermon." And we sat down on chairs beside her bed, and she recited what he had said 2 hours before. She had the details, the illustrations. She clearly had heard his sermon. No electronics. There was no tape recorder. There was no camera. But she heard that sermon. And so afterwards, we went over to Joe Carr, because Joe Carr was Dad's mentor. And Dad asked Joe, his friend and the scriptorian, what to make of this kind of an experience, because really it shook him up a little bit. He didn't know what to make of this lady lying in her bed and hearing his sermon from 10 miles away. And Joe Carr told him, when a message comes carrying the power of love, you know its source. To be able to share that with Dan Whittemore was just a delightful, awesome experience. And yeah, it's one of those little miracle kinds of things that you're talking about. But I got back home and found a copy of Dad's book on quiet ministry, and I mailed a copy to Dan Whittemore. But sure enough, Dad did mention Joe Carr in there as the scriptorian mentor that he had liked very much to consult with. And he had a different story about Ethel Johnson and her phenomenal acuity that way. To be able to reflect upon miracles, and I'm reminded of that because he also tells of a miracle that he had relative to the Book of Mormon when I took him on a tour of Mexico. And so there's just a wealth of material, but it's generally hiding in the interstices of our minds, and generally not the stuff that gets the attention I believe it deserves. So thank you very much, Terry, for volunteering to pick up this topic. And I've intruded on Roger Gilbert's time quite a ways here.
Okay, Roger, go ahead, please.
Yeah, you're not intruding, Paul. That's a great story, and that's one of the reasons why I'm on this forum, is to hear those stories. So I appreciate that. I was just thinking that if you want me to share this screen, I can show you that YouTube page right quick.
Let's do it.
If I'm capable. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, that was starting January 1 of this year. And those are the first 8 of the year. And that's the way they would look. And I'm working on a directory to make it a little easier to find, but I just needed to get a few loaded so I could figure out how to do it.
Wow.
And so that's a start, but I just gave them the name of that you gave them, basically. And anyway, that's the way it looks. And if you pull up right now, you can find that. And I'm going to be adding, if you want, I wanted to be sure this was what you wanted before I went too far. But if you want, I'll start dumping them all in there.
That's exciting. Wednesday, do you have any recommendations? Are you still there and able to take a look?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that. My friend was talking to me. Any recommendations on what could go up?
Well, he's got the channel content on the screen in front of us.
Okay, yeah. Are you talking about maybe Because what I could do was, what I was wondering if I could do was like add captions to it, like subtitles, not subtitles, because it's not in a different language, but
In other words, do time signatures, break it
yeah.
up a bit to say, okay, this is what at minute 42 was being talked about, just so people can go jump through it a little bit and see the different points that were being discussed. Is that what you're referring to?
So sometimes making sure it's people who might be hard of hearing can use it is what I'm talking about. But
okay.
That's also a good idea.
Rick's got his hand up. Go ahead, Rick.
I will just add, I think this is cool. I noticed on the restrictions it says made for kids, and I think you should change that because this is the idea is YouTube wants to know if this is like marketed to like really young children, and I know our stuff is all at worst PG and mostly G, but this is not really made for kids, it's made for adults. So I would just say that. And I think YouTube actually, just to answer Wednesday's point there, they do add captions automatically, but a lot of times, especially with Zoom, it doesn't work very well. but it does have that kind of built in. So
it does. So I work in disability advocacy, and my deaf friends, the auto ones sometimes don't always capture some particularities right, but they are there. Yeah. And yeah, if you have it set to made for kids, people aren't going to be able to comment.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Great input.
Yeah. So
I didn't know. I haven't done enough of these. And I picked that. I thought, well, these are rated G, so I hope so. But I didn't know that detail. So it said I can change all this, and
it's not really marketed to kids. It's really more of an adult thing. So
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I figure out how to unshare now.
All right. Well,
There you go.
we're approaching 10 o'clock, and so I'll sing us out unless nobody's going to object about. Good night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. You'll see my wife looking up over my shoulder there. I'm confident that she continues to watch over and pray for us too. Good night.
Good night, everybody.